Good evening and welcome to Covenant United Methodist Church. This is our Monday edition of Reflections on the Rock, as when we do an interview of an interesting person. And so this evening I am joined by Dr. John Tyson. And John is a good friend of Covenant's and has led numerous adult classes on a variety of things. He is the professor of church history and director of United Methodist Studies at Colgate, Rochester, Crozer Divinity School, and has been for quite some time.
About a dozen years.
Yeah, really? Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay, time flies.
It does.
So John is here tonight because I feel like I'm sitting next to the font of knowledge as far as United Methodist history and what it is that, where we gather our traditions and our beliefs and what makes Methodism unique. Earlier in the summer, we've been having several conversations with people who kind of gave us an overview of what's happening in the United Methodist Church today and the potential of what the future might hold. But this, from John's perspective, this isn't necessarily anything new in the Methodist movement. And currently, he is writing a book to add to this is only a few of the many books that John has written about Methodism and the way of the Wesleys. He's an authority on John and Charles Wesley, most particularly on the Charles Wesley hymns. So, and I have to say, they're not my favorite, but I have a feeling I'm not appreciating their full value.
It's possible you haven't seen the best ones.
Well, the ones in our hymnal.
Yes.
So, John, if you could just, I said to someone the other day, we're in an elevator and we're going up. We have a few minutes. Can you tell us why you believe that in the Methodist movement, the history of the United Methodist Church, we've survived perhaps even worse conflicts and divisions before? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but based on your knowledge, are you fearful about what is potentially coming down the pike?
Whoops, not really. My sense of this is that quite often there has been a growing polarity or polarization in our community. And we've been hesitant to acknowledge that because that is unchristian,
right,
unpious,
right,
unspiritual. And so we've tried to do workarounds for a long time. In some instances it just blew up and people walked out. I mean, that would be the other example. Right. But when we do the workaround, we really lose momentum, we lose people,
sure,
and we lose a lot of resources that could be spent in other ways.
I see that exactly happening right now in our church even.
In this moment, really.
Yes. Yeah. And so you're saying that's happened before.
It happened on slavery in this country.
Oh.
That debate lasted almost 40 years.
Oh.
The women's issue was over 100 years. The LGBTI acceptance issue has been about 100 years. It became very public in the late 50s, early 60s, but it's now in the 2020s, the 2020s.
Right. 40 years or
more.
more.
So a lot of these controversies that are so recent really have had quite a shelf life. And then, of course, there's the pre-part of it that was not as obvious, not, behind closed doors, family conversation aspects.
I don't want to, I'm making the assumption that you know what we're talking about. Within the United Methodist Church today, we are approaching a general conference, which is the governing body of the denomination, on whether or not to split over this issue of really understanding Scripture is what it basically ends up being. And so it could be something as it tends to be something that we can just, or we cannot just dismiss. I mean,
Right.
it's really going to impact the future of the United Methodist Church.
There's no question.
And one of the people that I interviewed not too long ago was a young man who's in the ordination process, who's actually very hopeful about what's going to happen when and if the church splits, because we have an opportunity then to go back to our roots.
Yes.
So you are the number one authority in my eyes that know what our roots are as far as what we would want to save and what we want to get rid of. Why should our roots be so, what about our history is hopeful?
Well, there's obviously quite a lot in my mind. And in terms of our roots, it is fair to say that this is also kind of contentious, because there's folk who want to see us more like the Anglicans and Episcopalians.
Oh.
And there's folks who think that we're more like the Second Great Awakening revivalist. And then
Right.
there's people who see us as the social activists of the social creed, and that sort of thing. And really, we're all the above
Yeah.
and more, I think it's very important to remember that the genius of Methodism was that it did not intend to be a church in the institutional sense.
Yes.
And as long as Methodism conceived of herself as a movement, she had dynamism, she had open-ended thinking, openness to the Spirit to do new things. And as the movement became more focused on self-perpetuation and survival,
Right.
it became more like the others, if you will.
Right.
Some of whom they left to join us, if you will. So over the course of about 150 years, we became the churches we left and reacted against.
Wow. Yeah, I can see that so clearly. And yet at the same time, we have kind of embedded ourselves in an institution.
We have. And now's the chance to remake that.
Right.
You see, that's the hopefulness of the whole thing. And when I talk about a movement, Pastor Ann, I'm talking about a situation where head and heart work together, where persons and text work together, where there's a strong push for egalitarianism over against the social structures that people tended to bring into the church, which were harmful and divisive and demeaning for many
Right.
people.
Right.
And then this notion that we are biblical people in the broadest sense. We're Jesus people primarily, and then the rest of it, but in a way that captures the dynamism and the living spirituality of Scripture, rather than treating it as a law book.
Right.
You see? So when Methodism was a movement and we were testifying every Sunday about what God did in our life this week, we actually had to look for God at work this week in our life. And if we didn't find that and join God in that process, then we were asked why.
Huh.
And today we've become a spectator sport, where people come in, they park themselves. A few go beyond that, but we really have lost that dynamism of being a movement.
So this split, supposedly, gives us a chance to kind of, I've said several times in the last couple weeks, reboot
Yes,
and really do some soul searching, so to
Yes.
speak.
yes.
So you wrote this book called The Way of the Wesleys.
I remember that.
And he calls it a short introduction.
The other ones have 200 more pages.
Oh, okay. But it's written for the general reader. And so if you think that you want some more information about the history of the Wesleys and how they planted these seeds of Methodism, this would be a good one to grab. The Way of the Wesleys, John Tyson. And so if you were to take on the role of John or Charles Wesley, which, based on your class a few months ago, actually now with the pandemic, it was probably a year and a half ago or so, perhaps even more Charles Wesley.
Yes, he was the more whole person of the two.
Yeah.
Not entirely so, but more so.
So what was it that, because I just always think of Charles Wesley as the hymn writer.
But not so. I mean, he traveled and evangelized for almost 30 years, and he preferred to express himself most directly in written form, either in letters or in hymns or sacred poems. He preached 2 or 3 times a day often, maybe 4 times a week, 3 times a week for almost 20 years, but he preached extemporaneously.
Terrifying to me.
Well, I mean, he had a lot of the Bible in him. Susanna
Right.
taught them to
Oh,
read
yeah.
at 4 years of age, out of the Bible, out of the King James Version of the Bible, main textbook in the house.
Right.
So frankly, if you're doing that for 10 years and you don't know what's in the Bible, there's
Right, you're in
something
trouble.
seriously wrong with you as a human being. You're deficient in certain ways.
But they didn't just internalize the stories, and they internalized the theology.
Yes, and they lived a life, a vagabond life, to borrow a phrase, of itinerancy, where they ran into the harshness of the world on a regular basis, on a daily basis. I mean, John Wesley writes a pamphlet for prostitutes. John Wesley writes a pamphlet for drunkards.
Right.
John Wesley writes a book on homeopathic medicine. Well, why would a famous theologian do stuff like that? I mean, you can argue that John Wesley is the most famous theologian in the Anglican Church in the 18th century. Why is he writing about stuff like that? Because he sees this every day.
Yeah.
Every day.
Yeah.
More times than once a day. And so their theology is always in the conversation with real-world problems. And that's what makes this dynamism and this spiritual openness and this willingness to kind of break out of the mold, so to speak.
So would you say, or what would you say, theologically, John and Charles Wesley grounded their faith? I think what I would even maybe rephrase that. My United Methodist Church history teacher told me it was grace, that John and Charles Wesley's understanding of grace is what makes Methodism. What would be your take?
That works. I mean, it's another one of those questions that the answers vary to some degree as much as the answerer. To use a Wesleyan phrase to answer a Wesleyan question, I would say it's holiness of heart and life. That interconnection of inwardness, genuine Christian inwardness, and a desire to manifest that in a transformed life. In other words, transformed hearts beg to transform lives. My
Right.
life, your life, our life together, the life of our community, that sort of thing. So yes, that's about grace and not good works, and it's about a very inclusive grace that is not, for the predestined and the elect, which
Right.
tended to be the rich and powerful people in English society.
Right.
So yes, grace, but maybe grace in a larger sense, It's a communion table that has no barriers on it at any
Right.
kind. It's a pulpit or a testimony lectern that is open to everyone in the church.
So you're praying with the Wesleys. I have read that one.
Okay.
Because
How'd I do?
Very good, because it's very spiritual.
Yes, and they were.
Yes.
They were. Their life was lived from the inside out.
Yeah.
Now, they didn't get it right every time, but they were very much aware of the interior life. In a way, we modern folk are not always attuned.
Right.
We do a lot of repression. We do a lot of denial. We do a lot of wall building.
Yes.
And that's not really helpful in developing a spiritual life or spiritual community.
So it's called Praying with the Wesleys, and the Foundations of Methodist Spirituality. And I totally agree that when we get bogged down by laws, not to mention the Book of Discipline in any way, we tend to get distracted from really what feeds us.
Yes.
And I found this book to be well, not only informative, but spiritual, in that we prayed with the Wesleys when we would learn something about them, especially the hymns that would permeate through it. So I highly recommend this one.
Oh, thank you.
And tell me about Assist Me to Proclaim. That's the Charles
That's
Wesley.
a Charles Wesley biography, basically because so many years ago when I started out on this, I can date that, 1979, I walked into Jim Payne's office at Drew Graduate School, and I said, Jim, I'm going to write on John Wesley's theology of the kingdom of God. He said, that's a suitable dissertation topic, but you're not going to do that one.
Oh.
I said, really? He said, yes, you need to write something on Charles Wesley because nobody is. Nobody has. I said, there's probably a reason why no one has. He said, well, you don't want to do an easy thing.
Well, that's true. And really, it has served you well.
It has. But even better than that, perhaps, Pastor Ann, it's invited other people into the conversation.
Yeah.
You can't go to a Methodist meeting or reflection today of people talking about Methodist theology and not mention Charles any more than you wouldn't mention women or Susanna and others. So it forced the question about being more inclusive.
Yeah. So this is Assist Me to Proclaim. I think probably the best thing to do is Google or go to Amazon or something.
Yeah, they're all on Amazon.
And just Google and just search by John R. Tyson, and you'll find a long litany of different books. But let's go back to this holiness thing, this holiness of heart and life.
Okay.
That's internal work.
It is. And let's not misunderstand what they mean by holiness, because frankly, there's another one of those words that's going to get pretty icky pretty quickly.
Yes.
And their view was the life of God in the soul of a person. In other words, we invite God into our lives and we cultivate that energy of God's life within us till it becomes more and more the center of who we are. So we get to the point where we're not struggling between doing God's will or doing my will, or you're not struggling between doing your will or doing God's will. They kind of work together.
Yeah.
They kind of are, like a good partnership or of any kind, a friendship, a marriage, a courtship, whatever metaphor we want to use for a coupling process, if you will. Mm-hmm. The life of God in the soul of a person is this deep inwardness that St. Paul describes as Christ being formed within me. And so
Right.
I am in Christ, and I am a new creation.
Okay, so you're talking about personal holiness.
Right.
So,
And it does begin there, because frankly, corrupt people do not make good things.
well, that's, yeah,
Good people do not make good things.
right.
So there's no chance that corrupt people are going to make good things.
All right, so, we've got this person, would you say that comes first?
I think it does, but not in separation for the rest, because we don't live bifurcated lives like that,
Right.
Our lives are integrated between the inner and the outer, and the brain and the heart, and all that business, and my sense of self and my sense of community and relationships and so on. So yes, I do think it kind of starts with that, but some of us catch that vision in community. It's not simply something I discover in my closet. So there is a kind of a reciprocity about the way this works in a person's life.
Because you had said a few minutes ago that, John wrote these manuals to help prostitutes and,
Right.
and medical, homeopathic almost kind of medicine. And he was always concerned for those on the margins, for the poor, for the immigrants, whatever, the downtrodden, however you want to describe
Very
it.
unusual, frankly, for a privileged, white, educated person of his class.
Yeah.
Very unusual.
So you would say then that he had a pursuit of social holiness.
He did. What was happening in him impelled him to be the person he became.
Right. Yeah. Because, there's chicken or the egg.
That is true. And I don't know that that's an argument that we have to resolve, if you will, but I do know that in their case, they began with a kind of inward understanding, pursued it in outward ways and realized that they were pursuing it wrongly, so they had to change the inner dynamic and then found freedom to be a different person rather than a sense of duty about being a holy person.
Right.
So John describes it as having the faith of a child of God as opposed to the faith of a servant of God.
Right.
Because servants work from duty. Children
Yes, they
belong to
do.
the family. They're genetically there.
Right.
Good, bad, or indifferent, you're part of the family,
Right.
you know?
Well, I think what I'm hearing is, as we will hear more and more in the next year, because I think General Conference is about almost exactly 1 year away.
Yes.
By this point, people are practically on airplanes this time next year, hopefully.
Yes.
And so we have another year to really kind of think about this. But I really believe that what will be helpful for people who are concerned, I guess, about the direction of the church is to go back to our roots and read these, the history, the theology of the Wesley movement, the Methodist movement, because I do feel like we have this golden opportunity.
We do. There's a scholar who has a very interesting name. Her name is Phyllis Tickle.
Oh, yes.
And she's written several books, perhaps you've seen them, which basically argues theology or the church changes her direction completely every 500 years.
Yeah.
And that was 2017. So that's kind of about when our change started.
Yeah.
And I'm not a really big pattern person, but this does kind of help. It's kind of
So
helpful.
what was happening 500 years ago? The Reformation?
Protestant Reformation.
Okay. All right.
Then the East-West split in
Right.
Christendom.
Yeah.
And then the exile from Palestine. And then
Wow.
the Babylonian captivity.
Wow. If you're not up on your church history, I do see a pattern, and I do remember reading that every 500 years, and so we're kind of due.
We're due, and maybe in a good way, if we
Yeah.
can get past the pain and the trauma of having, people we care about disagree with us deeply,
Right.
on both sides of the question.
Right.
Yeah. Just to say one other thing, if you don't mind.
No, go ahead.
I have done some pastoring, as you perhaps
Yes.
have heard, and I have found invariably when there's a situation like this in a local congregation, and people do wind up separating themselves from the congregation for various reasons, there is also a sense in which you add by subtraction,
Yes.
because the bitterness often goes with the person,
Right.
and you get to start again.
Right.
And that energy of starting again is attractive, it's winsome, and it causes growth. And also, I'm not saying good riddance,
Right.
but I'm saying maybe good future.
Well, you don't want to squander that energy.
No, and it happens all too often.
Yes. Yes, I've seen it.
Yes.
I've never thought to articulate it, but I know what you're talking about. I know. So what do you, based on our roots and your vast knowledge of church history, what are you excited about? What do you want to see happen?
I think we have a real chance to rethink our polity. I think our polity is a main problem because we have become very top-heavy, very institutional, and it's just kind of squeezed some of the life out of the movement.
Yeah.
And I'm not arguing for a congregationalism or something that is non-affiliated, but I do think we have to come to the point where we can be more light on our feet, shall we say, about making changes and answering particular needs in local communities, and maybe affiliating ourselves differently in our region that would be advantageous, might be advantageous to us. And you look at our giving, the percentage of our big giving that is designed to prop up the structure is sort of embarrassing.
Yeah.
It's sort of embarrassing. No offense to those people whose jobs I'm speaking about.
Exactly. So you have this, you're echoing what I heard earlier in an interview, is that there's almost a hopeful opportunity for us not to squander that energy.
Right. Two things to say about that, if I might. First of all, it's important for us all to remember that Christianity started as a synagogue, which is 12 people who advocated for spiritual growth, spiritual opportunity, spiritual fellowship. And then the second thing was that we really church doesn't mean building.
Right.
It means those who respond to a call from God,
Right.
or a call of the gospel, or the call of Jesus. And so we have really let church become the building,
Yes, we have.
and
I confess.
to our detriment.
Yeah.
To our detriment.
Yeah.
And we won't start telling stories about how many times we've nearly lost the building, or
I know.
we've been enchained by the building. And
There is, and Covenant probably more than any church that I've ever worshiped in, there is a holiness, there's a spirit.
There is.
But to make that the idol,
It's very tough, isn't it?
Yes.
And we as human beings, so many of us have a need for place,
Yeah.
because we feel sort of disjuncted, thrown into life, if you
Right.
will.
Right.
And so I understand that, but I think it's something we have to continually ask ourselves about.
You mentioned a few minutes ago, before we started recording, you're working on a new book,
I'm working on 2 new books.
two new books. So tell me the one about conflict and,
Well, I realized that conflict and crisis are not new to the Methodist tradition. And so I gave myself the task of analyzing those main social, political, religious, spiritual crises that gave birth to Methodism in the 18th century. And they were things like economic disparity, spiritual lethargy, exclusion, intentional exclusion of people by class or location, by education. I have 11 or 12 chapters, each based on one of these themes that were true in the 18th century. And so it's not a surprise that it is in the Methodist DNA to respond to crises. I mean, what do you do when people don't come to church? Well, you build bigger churches. Maybe you ought to go out there where the people really are,
Right,
right.
right.
and talk to them in terms they understand. And if it involves teaching them to read, then let's do that too, So we've always had this kind of, let's make it work kind of attitude.
yeah.
And so the first half of the book is about those sort of things: exclusion of women, oppression of people of racial background, racial minority background, exclusion of people of sexual minority background, that sort of thing. And then some of these are strictly then to look at crises that caused division. And there were the first 2 years of the movement. The one had to do with Calvinistic theology, because the Wesleys couldn't swallow the idea that God intentionally chose some people and
not
intentionally
others.
left out other people, just because God is powerful. And they noticed that the people who tend to be described as being left out were people who were poor, women, children, low class, uneducated, racial minorities. We can make the list. They're all the people that society says
Right.
are excluded. And if you read the gospel, that's exactly to whom Jesus preached and
Right.
went and ministered.
Right.
So that was a big problem. And then the second major division happened at the same time, was the so-called stillness controversy, in which a group of people within the society, the small group where the Wesleys received their saving grace, decided that it was best to wait for God to move you toward deeds of practice and holy living, because if you went on your own, you might be working your salvation rather than following God's grace. So this group became so pious, they became antinomian, and by that I mean they did not keep the laws of God. They didn't go to church, they didn't take communion, they didn't do any kind of social action, they didn't go to evening prayers, and they began to criticize people who did. And that didn't last very long.
Right.
That didn't last very long at all, because of that holiness of heart and life dynamic that was so much a part of the West. And in each case, they lost very close friends. George Whitefield was a Calvinist,
yeah,
and
yeah.
the Wesley brothers were never quite the same with him after that. And 4 of the early people who were mentors to John and Charles Wesley in their spiritual journey were among those Moravians who wound up separating from the Wesleys over the inclusion of good works aspect.
Right.
And they were very clear: it's not that good works save us, but a saving faith works in our hearts by love.
Right. Yeah, as you're saying this, we're in the book of James now. So, of course, there's that
There you are.
very famous
There you are.
argument.
Yes.
I wonder, too, if you were to recommend, by the way, what's your second book?
Oh, the second book is called Pictures of Jesus, and it's a study of Charles Wesley's metaphors that he uses to explain to us who Jesus Christ is for us as faith believers.
Oh, for instance.
Well, I have a friend in what a friend of sinners. Jesus, lover of my soul, amorous love kind of thing. Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, the captain of our salvation, friend of sinners.
Yes, yes.
On and on. I mean, a lot of these. 15 of them, to be exact.
15 metaphors.
15 metaphors. Some fairly common, priest and victim.
Oh, okay. So you had, the other thing you had mentioned, I don't know if everybody knows this, but Charles Wesley wrote how many hymns?
Again, some dispute. I mean, people will say 3,000 because they're thinking about how many were published. Some people will say 6,000 because then they're talking about which ones could possibly be sung. But if you're going to say hymns and sacred poems, you're talking about more like 9,000
Really?
hymns and sacred, some of which are 40 verses long, as we talked earlier,
Yeah.
and some of which are a stanza. But if you think about Charles Wesley writing a hymn every day for 50 years of his ministry, you get a sense of what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
This was part of his devotional, spiritual personhood.
Practice. Yeah. What iambic pentameter, or what did he just?
43 different meters.
Really?
3 sevens,
43.
3 sevens, 5 sevens, 13 twos. Iambic pentameter wins because it's most singable.
Yeah.
But when he's experimenting or he sees something in Spencer or Addison, Dryden rather, that looks interesting, he'll try that.
Wow. I wonder if he ever did a haiku.
Haiku was not known then, but he did write what we might call blank verse that kind of rhymed more in the head than on the page.
Yeah. Yeah, that art, it really is an art to be able to write poetry, and because it connects, well, the heart with the words. I mean, they're very poetic.
One
graceful.
commentator, Mabel Beresford, said that the reason why Charles Wesley wrote so often an iambic pentameter is because that fit the rhythm of his horse's gallop. He was hearing that in his head a lot of the
Sure.
time. I never thought of that, but I thought that's an
No.
interesting idea.
Wow, 43. Oh my gosh. Well, if you were to offer our listeners, our watchers, whatever, viewers, some primers for, educating themselves, because I really think, I'm really latching onto this hopeful piece,
Yes.
that we have a golden opportunity to do something with the way we worship and the way we engage outside of this building, I won't call it a church, and to solidify this idea that when you define church as what did you just say? The church is not a building.
It's those who have responded to a call.
Those who have responded to a call.
So we're talking about people and not a structure.
Yes.
Yes.
It's very exciting to think that, intimidating as well, because I'm
yes.
dyed in the wool. I mean,
None of the things they taught us in seminary are true anymore in terms of
No.
how to make things work.
yeah.
They were true then, but things have changed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we do a lot of these new church starts in our conference, and I give them a lot of credit. It's a hard thing to do.
It is indeed.
To just always know you can come in and there's a place to sit down, and
Yep.
we have a structure to the way we
Yep.
worship.
Yep. And if you want to grow your church, then you have better programs. If you program, they will come.
Yeah.
That was kind of the
Yeah.
mantra when
Yeah.
you and I went to school. And now the truth is we need to go to them,
Right.
them being the people that are unchurched or not coming for whatever reason, in terms that make sense to them.
Yeah.
So that's the difference between an attractional church. I attract you to come in the front door by whatever gimmick, or the missional church that says, I'm coming to you, look out, I'm going to be where
Right.
you are.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
comfortable or uncomfortable, that's as it's going to be.
And the Wesleys were far more missional.
Missional from the outset.
Yeah.
Missional from the outset.
I'm just out of curiosity, real quick. What did they find unappealing about the Anglican Church?
The class. I mean, imagine if you had to rent a pew in order to have somewhere to sit.
Sure.
And the lethargy that we have this, the world is falling down around us, and you're reading me sermons from the 1600s? I mean, are you serious?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So it was more that kind of thing than the doctrines and the deep spiritual practices of Anglicanism come from the early church, the early Christian women and men, and they stole all those.
Right.
It was this stuff in between.
Well, I also want you to say briefly, I know that John and Charles Wesley and the numerous brothers and sisters just didn't all of a sudden just take confirmation class and they were, brilliant, and they had someone that really drove that in their life. And so I would hate to, promote John and Charles without saying something about
Mother Susanna.
About Mother, yeah.
Yes. Really an extraordinary person, and just beginning now to receive her due attention, as Charles has just begun to receive his due attention by scholars and others. But, I mean, if you think of someone who was deprived of formal education as a young woman in her early teens, and who solved that problem by reading every book in her father's library, you get a sense of what's in this person.
Wow.
And she's a person who will not be stopped, who has a workaround to all of the things that people put in her way. We can't send the kids to school, so we educate them at home. And she did. And they went to school 4 hours in the morning and 4 hours in the afternoon. And yet she found time to have an hour with each child independently of the others. And there were 9 to 11 of them at any one time.
Wow.
So that she would get to know them as individuals and not treat them as a part of the group.
Yeah. Now, I remember there was something that she would ask the children every time, or maybe it was Charles, something. Was it the question, how is it with your soul?
Yes, every week.
She asked that every week.
Yes.
My mother never asked me that. I've never asked my children that.
No, nor have I. I guess we failed as parents, huh?
Yeah. Wow.
And yet maybe you get the how are you, or how, I sometimes say, well, how's your mental health, and laugh a little bit, but that's kind of what I'm talking about, really,
Yeah, it must have been remarkable. She was the bedrock, I think, of that family, and from what I understand, John and Charles adored her. I mean,
they did, and John to the point where it's difficult for him to have a relationship with a woman because no one quite measured up to Mother. Charles not quite so much in that regard.
Well, one last thing. I've done this before, and it was wonderful. You can audit a class at Colgate, Rochester, Crozer Divinity School, and attend one of John's courses. And if you ask really, really nice, he won't make you write the papers.
Audit does not involve the papers.
Okay, good. But they're very informative. I've still used my what you taught on atonement in numerous, and I feel like I can read ordination papers a lot more.
I bet you can.
So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
But certainly encourage you to look into that if you're curious. What course are you teaching this?
I'm teaching ancient medieval church history this fall currently, and I'm also teaching a course on American religious history, which did not fly for lack of an appropriate enrollment. But that's a good course because you get into the women's issue, the black immigrant issues, a lot of heavy stuff there.
Right.
I do believe in the spring I'll be teaching John Wesley. Yes, I believe that's possible.
All right, so mark your calendars. It's roughly 13 weeks.
Yeah, more like 15 weeks, but with breaks.
Yeah, and good reading. It's I found it very helpful.
Block course, 3 hours once a week. It'll be virtual as well as in person.
Oh.
So you have your choice.
Okay. So again, this is just a sampling of his many books that he's written, not just about the Wesleys. You also have the Great Athanasius.
Yes, first great black theologian in the Christian church, the theology behind the Nicene Creed.
Yeah. Well, as you can see, a very smart man.
Oh, come on.
So I know. And, you know, a good friend and a good friend of Covenant. So thank you, John.
Very
I really
welcome.
appreciate
It's
it.
been a pleasure.
And again, you know, get onto Amazon, look for John R. Tyson, Tyson, and these books, The Way of the Wesleys, Praying with the Wesleys. It was wonderful. As a matter of fact, if you're thinking of a really good Bible study or of adult class at church, that would be a wonderful possibility for you as well.
Perhaps like 6 weeks, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, you wouldn't want to rush your way through it because that's
true.
the beauty of it, is just really being able to kind of internalize that kind of spirituality. But, you know, for those of us who have claimed Methodism as our faith choice all our lives, it's just encouraging and affirming to know that there's deep and rich history associated with this movement.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully this new energy that will soon be infused into our denomination will put it to good use.
That would be my hope and prayer as well.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, John.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Good night.